looking back on it, from 10 years on, it might seem an extremely obvious comic to do. You know, an obvious success because fantasy is so popular. But at the time it wasn't. At the time, fantasy comics had a very bad name.
I remember sitting in a linoleum covered office 10 years ago, 11 years ago, when we hatched out the idea with some very brilliant contributors, very brilliant writers. And 5 years later, 2000 AD was ready for the knife. It was finished. Or we injected some money into it and we merged another title into it, and it slowly came round. But it's been a very long haul. It's successful today because it's become a cult.
My first involvement with 2000 AD was working there as an art assistant on the editorial staff of a comic. And I worked with Jan Shepherd, who was the art editor. I then became art editor and subsequently went freelance to do Robusters for 2000. And 2000 AD really maintained my interest in British comics. Up until then, I've pretty much given up on a UK comic actually being as dynamic and interesting as the stuff that was being produced in Europe and America.
Our own enthusiasm for each other's work kept it all going, really. I think that was part of the reason for the popularity, that the enthusiasm of the creators was passed through to the readers, you know, which is the general British comic, the general tone of it is very, well, it's dull, isn't it? You know, it looks dull, reads dull, no one cares, you know, nothing comes out of it at all to the reader. It's just cynically plonked in front of them, you know, buy this. Yeah.
When I first began working on 2000 AD, they were initiating splash pages, which had only really been seen earlier on an early sort of Pat Mills, John Wagner production, Action and Battle, which are the precursors of 2000. But that was so striking to see a full-page splash intro, a kind of a dynamic opening picture and large panels. And then what happened was, I think guys like Dave Gibbons and Mike McMahon brought to their work the breakdowns of American comics, and particularly Will Eisner's material, which was broken down into multiple panels and following the same character across a shifting background and fixed camera images. I think that just made 2000 AD look so strikingly different to the kind of stodgy, straight illustration style of Valiant and Lion, which had served their purpose. They were very well illustrated, but they just looked like, someone described them to me once as chessboards, heavy black and kind of grimy white. You know, they were good in their day, but IPC simply weren't moving on.
Action was started by IPC in early 1976. It was the immediate forerunner of 2000 AD, and it was very important because it was a comic very deliberately produced to find a new market. It was aimed at streetwise kids. Up until then, John Sanders, in fact, said to me his aim, or before that, had always been the slightly introspective, quiet, thoughtful child who likes a bit of fantasy. And here was a very gritty, streetwise, knowing and cynical comic. And it was a runaway success, where the tradition with comics is, you know, they come out at a huge print run and very, very quickly tail off, and that's particularly true with IPC. At the time when they actually withdrew Action under protest, its sales were climbing sharply, and very quickly it ran into criticism. As early as March, it came out in February, as early as March, The Sun was panning it in a centre-page spread called The Sevenpenny Nightmare. Within a couple more months, radio and television had picked it up, and then in September, they began a new story called Kids Rule OK. The premise of Kids Rule OK was a world where adults had died out and kids had to recreate society for themselves. And it was very violent, I don't deny that. But what was important about it was seeing kids wrestling with problems of authority, organisation, and that wasn't acceptable. And under the guise of cutting down on the violence, people like W.H. Smith, Menzies and a number of other big firms, the Retail and Newsagents Association and so on, effectively demanded the suppression of the cynical political content.
Basically, Action was meant to be what the title suggested. 32 pages of action that were in step with what kids could see in the cinema and stuff. And Pat trod that fine line very well, but when he left, that line wasn't trod so well. People didn't quite understand the difference between gratuitous violence and violence that was justified by the story, and they came a cropper.
You see, when 2000 AD then hit the streets, it had all those elements, but it had them at a safe distance. It set them in the future. Yeah, you could have an over-the-top judge who was very, very violent and made you wonder about authority, but he was 100 years in the future, post-nuclear war, and there was a kind of safety in that. So I think that's part of the importance of action, that it both broke new ground, but it also rang slap bang into the dead hand of authority, who didn't want to see stuff like this around.
2000 AD, in effect, was obviously inspired by action, and it was an attempt to fulfill the promise of action, which hadn't come through because it was brought out in too much of a rush. The violence tended to overshadow the very real potential in artwork terms. There were good artists coming through. And looking at individual pictures in action, it occurred to me that we could really play on this and have a large visual, very art-orientated product. There were one or two artists on action who had the potential to rival American artists.
2000 AD made the people who worked on IPC Juvenile was very suspicious. I don't think they liked what we were doing. They felt it was vaguely subversive. The mail response to issue 1 was incredible. The office was filled with sacks of letters to Tharg, this green alien editor we made up just as a bit of amusement, which again was different. I mean, old British comics normally have this sort of anonymous guy called the editor, if anyone, and they never had any editorial viewpoint. Tharg was, if overused now, but at the time he was a different viewpoint, and he was cocky and he was very self-centered. And I think the readers just loved it. They just loved the idea that this guy was coming down and imposing his new comic on the British public.
Tharg came about as was policy at the time for the comics not to credit any, quote, real people. Every comic at the time in IPC's stable had a fictional editor. So when 2000 AD was thought of, it was obvious they were going to say, well, yeah, we've got to have a fiction editor of some sort. Why not an alien? And it was Pat Mills that came up with Tharg. He's very, very popular with younger readers. It's very difficult. I mean, we had a lot of at the convention this year. There was a lot of people saying, "Oh, Tharg's, you know, get rid of him. He's boring." But to the younger readers, he's absolutely real. They write to him. They send him invites to birthday parties. And I mean, you know, we have a lot of fun with him because, you know, he is, to them, he is the actual editor. So anything goes wrong, we always blame him.
Thinking of the various 2000 AD stories, the first one, Invasion, which we got slagged off by the Guardian, something cruel because of the Russian connection. It wasn't that we were being right-wing, it was the subversion that appealed to me. The idea of sequences, for instance, such as where Thatcher is shot on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral. Angela Rippon is on TV saying the Russians have invaded us. That was the element we got off on. We weren't really taking a political side, and we also knew at the same time it would make a damn good adventure story. We had to temper that with commercial reality. Something else we knew that I think people looking back on 2000 don't always appreciate, which is it's the crap stories which sell a paper, not the quality stories, and we knew that, and it proved to be the case that things like Judge Dredd, which took a while for people to accept and adjust and get used to it, took maybe 12 issues. The crap story did really well, Mach 1, a rip-off of the $6 Million Man, and that really sold the paper, probably more than any other story, unpalatable as it was to us all at the time. We knew that because on Battle, the story we all despise called D-Day Dawson, about a typical guy who he's got a year to live and he wonders whether he can get to Berlin before his D-Day. we all sneered at this story and we thought, God, what a load of shit this is. And it went down well, and we hated the guy. We'd given him 12 issues. We thought 1 month of his life per issue. And by about issue 4, he was suddenly incredibly popular and we couldn't kill the bastard off. And he lived on for year after year. You know, until he eventually, I think even kids eventually realised how pathetic he was as a character. But it's the simple ideas sometimes that people assimilate. What you might call the intelligent or the more perceptive audience, the fan audience, they don't come through in enough numbers. You've got to cater initially for the bulk audience who, over a period of time, their tastes improve. Arguably we as writers and artists have to some extent improved. You know, our tastes have developed and matured.
At 2000 AD, when it was in production for a year, which is a very long time for a new British comic, it started out as a science fiction version of action, and the action problem had been taken off the stands and causing a lot of problems with the complaints to MPs and so on, influenced 2000 AD, I think, for the better. The original stories in 2000 AD, like Invasion and Mach 1, were extremely violent. We had to censor almost every page of it. There were guys having their heads kicked off and limbs flying about. I think what it made us do was concentrate on the science fiction and fantasy aspects and build up a kind of a science fiction mythos for the comic instead of out-and-out violence. I think 2000 AD would have been just as good, but would have lasted about 12 months as an action comic, because it would have been taken off the stands.
A lot of the really strong stuff has never seen the light of day in 2000. For instance, there was a subversive element in Mach 1. Originally, he went kicking holes through people. You know, his actual foot went right through people, because I thought it was stupid that if he's got this incredible power and he'd actually knock people's heads off, all that went. So that was one level of censorship. Another story that got censored in those early days was The Visible Man. The board thought it was disgusting, the idea of a guy who you could see inside his body, which was actually making a very telling point to my mind about you know, racism and the way, you know, this guy's different. You know, he's the same as everybody else. He just happens to be visible. There was a lot of that sort of thing went on, and it kind of bedeviled us down the years. It still does, but I think we've all got that much more expert at finding ways of getting around censorship. We are aware that our readers are older, and therefore we can infer things, and they know what we're getting at. The editor knows what we're getting at, but it's not spelled out.
We use the very best artists and writers that we can find. In turn, by finding these people, we get the very best characters and artwork, which is what attracts people initially. And then probably we don't take anything too seriously. I mean, there's a very strong streak of black humour through 2000 AD.
For a long time considered the idea of a career in comics, but then thought the sort of comics that I wanted to do wouldn't really have any place in the mainstream comic field. Seeing an issue of 2000 AD for the first time and reading these incredibly aware and funny sort of strips by John Wagner and Pat Mills, I realised that there were adults at work here. There were people who were doing stuff that they enjoyed and that other adults could enjoy, and I thought, well, maybe there is a place for me in comics. And I'm sure that that is not an uncommon experience amongst sort of British comic creators of my generation. We saw 2000 AD, and for the first time realised that here was an opportunity to do comic fare of the sort that might interest us, rather than the standard Beano dandy stuff of the past sort of 40 or 50 years. As a result of that, I think that you suddenly got a huge burst of British talent coming up through 2000 AD, who might otherwise have stayed outside the field. I'm talking about Mike McMahon, Kevin O'Neill, Pat Mills, John Wagner, Alan Grant, you know, so all of those people, Dave Gibbons. And because we were allowed a certain amount of freedom, and I say it was only a certain amount of freedom that we were allowed at 2000 AD, but it was more than we would have been allowed previously. That enabled us to actually show what we could do without the restraints. We could do stories that were funny, we could do stories that were genuinely affecting.
From a very early point on, British fandom artists started to come through. They were introduced to us when people knew we were doing a fantasy paper. The grapevine got around. That was Dave Gibbons, Kevin O'Neill, Brian Boland was working on power man for Africa. But I was so keen to get his work in any shape or form that I could, because you don't need to be an art purist to know that, you know, you're looking at an absolutely brilliant artist, that I got him to do a series of covers. Just said, draw whatever the hell you like, and we'll run it as a 2000 AD cover. And that's why you'll see from about, I think, issue 8, 9 or 10 onwards, there's a whole range of Brian covers with the most, you know, contrived stories desperately trying to link up to the artwork. Now, in the early stages, I suppose, there was this conflict, if you like, between the Spanish artists, who were really just production guys, mutton dressed up as lamb, and real quality guys like Dave Gibbons and Brian Boland and Kevin. And over a period of time, more fantasy artists from this country came through, and therefore one could slot them into the paper.
Well, I've been out of college about 2 years, hadn't done any work, and just got a really lucky break. Pat Mills saw my work and liked it, and gave me a chance, because it was very rough, but he thought he could see something in there that was going to get better. So, and I was put straight onto a weekly strip as my first work. I was laughing, you know. Because the last thing I ever wanted to be was a British comic artist, a typical British comic artist, which is very anonymous. I wanted to be something not clever or, you know, anything like that, but just to be myself rather than fall in line. And because I didn't know what I was doing, I think that's why it worked, you know, because I didn't have any plan or any set idea about what I did want, you know, the character to be like. Well, when I started, I was very poor. You know, the work was very bad that I was doing, and there were mistakes in it that I knew were mistakes, but people thought I was doing it on purpose. See, like big feet or something like that, which, you know, I knew the feet were too big, but I just lose perspective when I was actually involved in doing the job. And people would say, "Wow, look at those feet! You know, this is great." You know, so I thought, well, yeah, you know, I might be onto something. You know, so I just sort of took it from there. It was the only sort of handle I had to grab hold of with the thing, so I just went with it. Well, what always impressed me about something like Asterix was that although everyone had big noses, but everything did look very real. It was all well lit, and it looked like 3 dimensions. And that was struck me as being the way to go about these things. You know? So I just wanted to bring this sort of outrageous, sort of cartoony look, but to try and set it in a sort of 3-dimensional world, and to create sort of an internal reality, so that everything was distorted. But the actual sort of drawing side of it is where the light and shade comes in and all that. So the cartooning is a sort of cerebral approach to it. But the sort of draftsmanship is what you need to sort of hold that sort of approach together.
Well, I always liked a grimmer art style, but it's strange because I started out doing a mixture of illustration stuff and Bigfoot cartooning, you know, for humour comics. And the material I grew up on was my Will Elder's Mad comic stuff from some of Mad paperbacks, and it had a big influence on me. It was kind of, again, it was guys who were doing straight illustration, doing humour, so my work has always been borderline black humour stuff, and I think Mad magazine had a lot to do with that. And just the type of illustrators I like, Adore and Arthur Rackham and Dulac. Slightly strange, it's semi-humorous and quite grim. You know, it's a dark side to it as well. And no one had been doing anything like that in British comics. And Pat Mills and I were working together on 2000. He always used to say, try and do stories which involve dreams or fantasies you've had. No matter how strange, you can work those images in. So that's what I've tried to do, and there's a lot of crossing. I mean, I like Joe Kubert's work and Eisner and Will Elder and people like that. And it's just a melting pot, really. I've never really. No, it did just come about. I think Nemesis of Warlock was a turning point, because we could do alien material and we wanted it to look really alien, you know. So Nemesis is quite warped.
I joined around about Prague 86, which I think was when 2000 merged with Star-Lord. I'd actually worked on Star-Lord as a sub-editor, and when they merged the 2 comics, I moved to 2000 as a sub-editor. and by Prog 100 I'd been made editor, which sounds a huge leap, but in fact on a comic there are only 2 editorial staff, the editor and the sub. And what happened was that the editor, Kelvin Gosnell, who started 2000 with Pat Mills, for reasons of his own decided to leave, and he very kindly recommended that I fill his shoes, and Tharg said yes. Judge Dredd came into issue 2, and really that was the only story that was, to all intents and purposes, a proper story set in the future. The other stories were designed to be like that, but Dredd was the only one that caught the essence of what it could be like in the future, in a humorous way as well as a dramatic way. Now what you've got to realize is that 10 years have passed and that the writers have grown up over those 10 years, and so have the readers. And the Dredd that you see today is a very different animal from the one that first appeared in 2000. My theory on that is actually that it's because Dredd himself has changed. The story is actually set so that as each one of our years goes by, a year in Mega City 1 goes by, and Dredd the character is actually 10 years older, and I believe that what's happened is that 10 years on the streets have actually changed him, and he has become a harder, more authoritarian figure. It's not the writers making him that way. They might think it's them, but I think he's got under their skin. And I believe that's what happens to a judge when he's been on the streets for 10 years. So, to sum up, when he started, he was a much more sympathetic character. But now he's not quite so sympathetic, but that's not his fault. I think it's the city has changed him, and in that sense I still have sympathy for him. I don't think of him as a fascist.
Judge Dredd was originally a guy who shot people for dropping litter. I mean, I remember when John suggested the idea to me, we thought it was a hoot, and that's what we wanted. And the problems of Dredd down the years have really been the compromising with the original concept with what's followed. So from time to time he's been a hero, other times he's a bastard, with John really going back to his original concept. They at one time were so worried about him, they wanted to stick him on the other side of the galaxy. They'd obviously seen the posters for Star Wars. Hey, we've got a great idea here. Let's stick him on, you know, the other side of the universe. I wasn't having that. I wanted him in New York.
Well, I was actually quite a latecomer to 2000 AD. I didn't work on the early progs. I think I actually came in as an editorial assistant on prog 94, issue 94. And I worked as sub-editor on 2000 AD for a year before I decided that I would leave to go freelance. So Judge Dredd had already been established for 3 years, more or less, before I came in on it as co-writer. John Wagner, the original creator and writer of Judge Dredd, was a close friend of mine, and he had been since we worked together for DC Thompson back in the 1960s. Basically what we do is we sit down opposite each other, and one of us, somebody's got to come up with the first idea. Somebody comes up with an idea, and John, you know, if I come up with something, John might say, no, I don't like that, how about this? And I'll say, well, I don't like that, how about this? And between us we hammer it out. It is very much a 50-50 process. It's not as if one of us comes up with a plot line and then the other one takes it away to dialogue it. We do both work on every aspect of everything together. I think that you'd find that in most of our work's pretty humorous. I mean, we do write straight stories as well, but most of our work has humour of some kind or other in it. And I think that it's quite common for humour writers to work as pairs. Quite a lot of famous radio humour writers and television humour writers work in pairs. I think that's because they end up committing suicide when they try to do it on their own, because the process of writing humour isn't always humorous. It's often very painful.
Judge Dredd is a wonderful idea that's given usually a very shallow and shabby treatment. I've read numerous Judge Dredds, and there's a chuckle or two along the way, but they never really dig very deeply into anything. A lot of it I call pop-off writing. They're words that sound glib when you say them, but really don't convey much meaning. And that's how I feel about Judge Dredd, and a lot of other comics I've seen coming out of both UK and America.
The beauty of Dredd is it works on several levels. I mean, the younger readers will read it and just enjoy the action. You know, the bikes, the shooting, etc. I don't think they would really appreciate if there was any sort of message or anything in it. As soon as you become old enough, you then read Judge Dredd with a fresh eye and see what we like to think is the black humour in there. I mean, Judge Dredd is one of the funniest strips I've ever read.
He's such a strong character, he dominates the whole story, doesn't he? I mean, typical British characters up to that time had been Tough of the Track, or Paddy Payne, or just sort of based on real people that the kids could probably identify with. I don't know. You know, they get bullied at school, but they read that they could win the Olympics, you know, by eating special bananas off some island in the Pacific or something. But Dredd, he just dominated the whole thing because he's got no personality. It's complete contrast to everything else.
He's a fascist bastard who gets some rather witty lines. There's a terrible dichotomy in Dredd. We have to present Judge Dredd as the hero. We ourselves don't actually see Dredd as being very much of a hero. We see him as being a representative of a totalitarian state. And we try to present this in as humorous a way as possible. Most of our stories are actually drawn from what's going on around us in the world today. We try to extrapolate it into the future and see if anything funny happens. But because the readership expects a hero, Judge Dredd has got to be the hero. So we have to write, as well as writing stories where Dredd can be seen to be a terrible ogre. For instance, we recently did a story called Democracy, where the people of Mega City 1, which is Judge Dredd's city, got together, decided that they wanted an end to the fascist right-wing judge system, and they wanted a return to democracy. So something like 20 million people went out on the streets to demonstrate for a return to democracy. And the judges went out and more or less beat them up and beat any dreams of democracy out of them. Dredd really is an anti-hero. I think that the worse we make him, the more people seem to like him. The more terrible things we have him doing, and people might hate him more, but at the same time they like the story more. Only once that I can think of have we featured a villain who actually gave Judge Dredd a really good going over, who didn't actually make a clown out of Dredd, but he was a ninja artist, a Japanese assassin who came into the mega city, and he really gave Judge Dredd a good pounding. But, and this is to do with what I was saying earlier about Dredd being the hero, so many people wrote in and said it's not right that Judge Dredd should get the shit kicked out of him like this. He's really got to get his own back. We've had to write a sequel to that story where the ninja assassin comes back to Mega City 1 on another job and runs foul of Dredd, and this time of course Dredd wins. Dredd's the hero, but it's a pretty good fight. We recently did it was a sort of competition. It was tacked on at the end of a Judge Dredd story. It was called So You Would Like to Be a Judge, and we put on a spoof cadet judge application form saying that the Academy of Law in Mega City 1 was willing to accept new applicants, new cadets from our time. Could you fill in the applications? Now, one of the questions that we asked on the application was, do you think the judges are A, not harsh enough, B, just about right, C, too harsh, or D, not nearly harsh enough? Now, a full 25% of the replies said that they thought that Judge Dredd was not nearly harsh enough. Now, if we took that seriously, I think that we would begin to worry about it. But I mean, I have a feeling that the ones who did that were entering into the spirit of the Judge Dredd strip, and they thought that that was the answer that would be expected of them, and that's why they put it in. At least I hope that's the case.
We don't deliberately set out to write violent stuff because we know that's what kids want, because we can't actually give kids what they want. If you do that, you get into all sorts of trouble, because they don't actually know their own level of sophistication. That's why I believe you have this trouble with them watching X-ray movies on video. They think it's cool to do it, but I think it is actually quite damaging for them. So the basis of 2000 AD is to take contemporary situations, project them into the future in a dramatic way, and leave it at that.
I don't think that reading Judge Dredd is going to tip anybody the wrong way, but you can't answer for you know, a lunatic, and there are lunatics everywhere. Comics are a field that attract perhaps more than their share of them, the same as role-playing games. Any subject which attracts people who become fanatical about that particular subject can end up in that way.
I can't see it myself, someone reading Judge Dredd and reenacting that. I'll tell you why, because it's very hard to get your hands on a lawgiver, a lawmaster bike, and it's very hard to get hold of the paraphernalia that exists in Judge Dredd. That, what, to me, makes it safe, the fact that you cannot imitate it. I may be wrong here, but I think comics, because traditionally they are thought of as a funny medium, it's easier for a reader to distinguish between what goes on in the pages of the comic and what he sees in the real world around him. But just in case I'm wrong on that score, if you look at 2000, it isn't actually that violent these days. Its strengths are the good artwork and the good writing. We don't need to be sensationalist to sell copies.
They know it's aimed at 16 and 17-year-olds, and it's absolutely stupid to, you know, try and suppress it. I think the only sad thing is we've all of us got such a long way to go. I mean, it should be far. I mean, it's an insult, really, to an average teenager, the way we have to suppress things. I mean, all right, there's a danger that if there were no restrictions on us, the whole thing would go pornographic, etc. But that's a phase people go through. It's inevitable. Then you come out the other end and maybe you produce good stuff, or somebody will produce some good stuff.
Censorship is an ugly word which we don't tend to use around the office. I mean, there's no real censorship, i.e. a code, you know, authority that the Americans use. We impose our own, you know, rules of good taste and morality on the comic as we see it. Which is the case again throughout the group on all comics. You know, depending on what the official target readership age is for the comic, then obviously it'll depend on that, what actually goes into it. We can get away with a bit more in 2000 because we do cater for an older readership. 2000 AD until very recently has been part of a constipated and monolithic comic book publishing empire which has done its very best to keep the creative person ground down there in the dust. I mean, the work that we did for 2000 AD is owned by the comic, owned by the company, which is shameful. The people who created Judge Dredd see only a pittance of the actual money that is earned by the vast amount of Dredd merchandising. Consequently, for my part, I don't really feel that sort of British comics, much as I would like to work in British comics, treat the creators with enough respect. When they change that, I think that you might have a thriving British comic industry again. And there are noises being made that suggest that they are at least thinking very seriously about changing the way they treat their creators, because I think they've just realised that 2000 AD is on the verge of becoming a very expensive training ground for American talent. They realise that what's basically going to happen if they continue to treat creators like dirt. And I'm not talking about the editorial people at 2000 who are wonderful people. I'm talking about the powers that be above them who to some degree direct their actions. I think that they have realised that sort of what they are going to be doing is training up amateur talent until it gets to a point
where it is significant, major talent, at which point it will be creamed off by the American companies and taken to work in America, where they actually do treat creators with a lot more respect. Hopefully, as sort of, like I say, that is changing. And I think that when it does, there will be no need for people like me or Brian or Dave or Kevin or any of the others to actually defect to the other side of the Atlantic. I think that then we will be able to produce British comics for a British market and feel that we are not being completely screwed in doing so. You know, I mean, until then, it's liable to remain a fairly moribund field.
I think if artists and writers own a larger part of the work that they do, that this can only be good for the medium in general, apart from being good for the writers and artists, because hopefully if they've got something worthwhile to say, they're going to make more money than just doing it as work for hire. I certainly think it's the way to go in comics. Again, a very backward in this, I mean, compared to any other form of artistic endeavour, be it books or film or whatever. I mean, we have been traditionally grossly underpaid for the amount of creativity we put in. I mean, I know people who are visualisers and artists for advertising agencies, and what we would do in a day, they probably wouldn't do in a week. But I think it's a question of getting rid of the kind of plantation mentality that it's so easy to get into as a writer and artist in mainstream comics, because you're paid just enough that if you keep producing, spend all your time producing, you can live reasonably well. But it's finding the space of time to create properties of your own and to execute them in the way that they need to be executed. In other words, to give the time that it takes to something. This is the thing. It's getting that initial momentum. It's starting the snowball rolling. But I think that's coming more and more. And I think particularly people who have proven that they can, in the mainstream, tell stories, that they've got the basic technique down. I think there are more and more doors opening that will enable them to create their own stuff and reap the benefits that are rightfully theirs.
Our work's repackaged in a way that looks far more attractive and more permanent than the original bog paper comic. The regret, of course, which is at the heart of 2000 AD's problems to this day, is that because of IPC's system of buying all the rights, that means that when it reappears in an album form, when it reappears in an American comic book format, in the case of Dredd, when it appears as a movie or a game or with computer games, apart from a peppercorn royalty, one gets absolutely nothing. And obviously that's a source of extreme bitterness, because what it creates is a pressure on you not to produce quality but quantity, which of course has been the problem endemic with IPC all down the years, that there's been this unsaid rule that the really good artists are the ones who are popular but fast, not the ones who are slow. When I would talk in a pub with other writers, I always felt furtive about the fact that I took longer writing scripts than they did.
Well, as a long-time comic fan who's known most of these people right from their fan days, I mean, to see them now working for American comics is great. And yeah, to see that the Americans have now recognised that the British writer and artist is as good, if not better, than their own homegrown talent is fantastic. As editor of 2000 AD, it's frustrating, obviously, but everybody on the editorial side of 2000 AD is restricted by company policy. And just at this point in time, I'm not saying this will be the case forevermore, the people that own 2000 AD don't wish to enter into the same sort of deals and rights and packages of extra incentives that they get in America. They much prefer to buy all rights outright. But having said that, I mean, now that this has been going on for some time now, and it's very obvious that we have lost some of our best talent, people are now taking a second look at the situation, and I wouldn't say the day is too far away when we'll be able to match the Americans, and hopefully that way get some of these people back.
It's not easy, of course. When you're dealing with people in the creative business, you will never be able to pay them enough. You will never be able to stop them going to the States, because there is a great kudos for them in going to the States. You will never be able to stop them spreading all their talents across a much broader spectrum than the UK. All we can continue to do, which we have done with great success in the past, is to mine the natural talent which exists in the UK, literary talent, and in the art schools.
You have to fill the gap because you are committed to putting out 52 issues a year. And I think we've done quite well, but what's happened is the kind of people we found to replace them are themselves now going to America.
The big compliment to a writer was, God, he can write 4 scripts in a day. You know, that was the ultimate thing. So it was very hard to come out from under this attitude, and I think perhaps it's a tribute to a lot of 2000 AD artists and writers that in this really unhealthy environment, and it is really unhealthy to work in, that they've triumphed over it. I mean, okay, it might be patchy, and you know, you get these lulls in 2000 where it's not very good, and then along comes somebody else who rejuvenates it. But really, they are working in a creative desert. So any blossomings that come from them are really to be commended.
Aaron Quinch is something that I'll probably ask to have destroyed upon my deathbed. I can offer no defences for D. Aaron Quinch. It was. I'm sorry. What can I say? It was. There are no socially redeeming features. What basically happened was that it was a short story that got out of hand. We did. It's like, you know, the World War II was a small skirmish that got out of hand. You know, I mean, I was asked to do a future shock, which was, well, future shocks for the uninitiated are very short science fiction stories that are used to fill up space in 2000 AD when one of the advertisers has dropped out or something like that. And so basically, I did this short story about a couple of alien juvenile delinquents who are responsible for the creation of life upon Earth and the destruction of Earth several thousand years later. And you know, that in itself was not a terribly sort of objectionable story. Then they said, hey, the readers really love this, do us a series. And I did. It didn't last very long because basically there are only so many things that you can do with people, well, where every episode ends with a huge explosion and limbs flying everywhere. You know, I mean, that was the whole point of D. Aaron Quinch. It was like continuing the tradition of Dennis the Menace, basically, but giving him a thermonuclear capacity. It was, I mean, and I really couldn't justify it from a social viewpoint. I'm sorry that I did it. I will never do it again.
Halo Jones was very much an experiment, as I understand it, because I was only involved with the very early days of the first Halo Jones book, to try and introduce a heroine in 2000 AD, whereas before it had been exclusively male preserved. We weren't sure how it should go down with the male readers, but in the end, I mean, not only was accepted by the male readership, but the female readership as well. Like, really took to Halo Jones, and you know, all the press the books have got since seem to, you know, mention the fact that girls like Halo Jones as much as male readers.
Judge Anderson, although she's a judge, she's a psi judge. She has psionic power. She's telepathic, and we made it one of the bases of the whole psi judge rationale, that psi judges are eccentric. Like most judges are like Judge Dredd. They're very authoritarian. They see things in black and white. But psi judges, because they've got sensitive minds, they can't be brainwashed in the same way that ordinary judges are. So Judge Anderson's a sort of mixture of heavy Dredd stuff but light humour at the same time. We prefer writing humorous stuff, but I have to say that if you write a heavy Judge Dredd and then have a humorous ending to it, it makes it worthwhile.
Oh no, I've got fondness for them all. I mean, I enjoy drawing all the time. And I've been fortunate, you know, that I had VC's, Rogue Trooper and Dredd. Possibly Dredd's the most enjoyable one to do. But I had a lot of fun doing VCs, a lot of complications as well doing VCs, because Gary and I were doing an episode about, more or less, and it sometimes meant that as Gary was finishing his episode, I had to start the following episode. So sometimes the continuity was difficult to maintain. You know, it was like very speedily sending photocopies of machinery through the post, which, you know, when you send it express and you're in a hurry for it, it never gets there. You know, so it was good doing VCs, yeah, and I'm glad to see that they've been reprinted.
Strontium Dog, who's a mutant bounty hunter in Great Britain in the year 2167, I think it is. And that's a lot more British in its humour than Judge Dredd is. But at the same time, Johnny Alpha, who's the Strontium Dog of the title, he is, in his own ways, as bad as Dredd is. his job is to track down criminals, and obviously the criminals, generally speaking, have to be as bad, you know, painted pretty bad so that Johnny can do as he wants in the capturing of them. Other stories we write, like the Ace Trucking Company, they're not heavy in any way whatsoever. The violence in them is Three Stooges slapstick type violence. There's nothing serious about them at all. They're written primarily as humour stories all the way through.
I can usually gauge a good strip if I will stop when the script comes in from the writer, whatever I'm doing, and sit and read the script straight through. And I'm doing that with Zenith at the moment, which is the first time we've actually actively gone out to do a super-powered character in a British comic. We knew we wanted to do something like this, but we wanted to do it the 2000 AD way, i.e. not like a straight super-powered character flying over tall buildings and, you know, leaping a single bound, all that sort of thing. And we were very fortunate to get the services of Grant Morrison, the writer, and Steve Yoel, the artist. And all the indications are we've got a new classic 2000 AD series, which we'll hope to continue into the future.
In 5 years' time, 2000 AD will still be selling 100,000 a week, if not more, and that by that time the contributors will be receiving royalties on the spin-off that 2000 AD creates, engenders. I would also hope that we would have between 4 and 6 fortnightly titles, again with contracts to match America. And as a third tier of this publishing house, this dream house, the third tier would be prestige comics, limited runs, maybe even whole graphic novels.
If you meet a young reader, you can bank on 2 questions being asked. The first is, what will 2000 AD be called in the year 2000? And the second question is, what does Judge Dredd look like under his helmet?